Putin was attempting to get NATO members to be more focused on their own domestic national security at the cost of Ukraine support?
I would say that is accurate. I would definitely say that's accurate. And God, when you have a finite amount of military equipment that you can source, right? If you eat that all up, then Ukraine has less, and it just makes it harder for Ukraine to defend itself. So I think that was kind of Putin's strategy all along.
But it seems like a rather sort of short-lived strategy. What's the fallout from that longer term?
Well, it didn't work. Not everything works.
This is The Global Gambit.
Today, my guest is Ryan McBeth, a returning voice, a returning mind of clarity and sanity in a world of absolute chaos or the international disorder that we like to say on the channel. I think, Ryan, this is like your 6th or 7th time very generously coming on. And I wanted to have a sort of two-part conversation, I think, partially on Russia-Ukraine, of course, and the major military developments around potential supply of Tomahawks and so on. But also you went on a fascinating sort of excursion, if you like to call it that, about Russia training Chinese troops. So I do want to unpick the sort of Taiwan, China, and the Russian element seemingly a little bit later as well. But I guess my first question really is just like, what do you make of everything that's been going on? I think we spoke 6 months ago, and the summer's been very active. So I'm very curious for your general takeaways over Ukraine's remarkable attacks on the oil refineries, but anything else that's really caught your mind?
The oil refinery thing was interesting. What I found even more interesting is that the attacks on the oil refineries certainly aren't helping, but it's not just Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries that are causing a problem inside Russia, or causing the gasoline prices to go up. It's the fact that Russia just doesn't have the capacity to manufacture more oil, or to drill for more oil. A lot of their rigs are Western, and kind of the issue is that these rigs, they haven't had a software update in about 3 years. So for a moment, let's forget about hardware. Let's just talk about software. If your drilling rig software hasn't been updated in about 3 years, that is a massive vector for viruses, right? So if these things are connected, it is a massive avenue for someone to come in and disable your oil rig remotely. So I would not be surprised if we're taking advantage of that now, or at least if Ukraine is taking advantage of that now. A lot of their oil rigs were manufactured by Western companies. So what you have now is a situation where, as these oil rigs break, they can't get new parts for them. Now, you might be able to manufacture some parts, but that requires machine tools. All right. So now you have a choice. There's a finite number of machine tools, and many of those machine tools are made by the West. A lot of them are made in Germany. Siemens makes a lot of machine tools. We're talking CNC manufacturing, right? Computer numeric control manufacturing. So if you don't have the ability to manufacture more parts, that means you're going to be cannibalizing some oil rigs to keep other oil rigs going. It also means that you might have to use those CNC machines to manufacture parts. So yeah, now you have bootleg parts, right? Parts that are not entirely not authorized, but bootleg counterfeit parts. Those might not work as well. And also, when you take a look at these machines, you have to think about, like, all right, how are we going to divvy this up? Because there's a finite number of CNC machines, right? So let's say you are a subcontractor and you can get a bid from the Air Force to make parts for the Su-20 or Su-34, and you can make parts for the domestic auto industry, and you can make parts for the oil industry. So you're going to take the highest bidding contract, right? So now, if you're a CNC manufacturer, if you're a machine shop, you have a choice. well, am I going to take the contract from the military or am I going to take the contract from the oil industry? So the military, let's say it offers, I don't know, 100 rubles for a part, and the oil company offers 90 rubles for a part. Well, you're going to take the military. So now the oil companies, they have to manufacture, or they have to offer more money for a part. So now that just creates inflation, right? Because the military is going to counter with their own offer, and so the price of everything just goes up and up and up. And meanwhile, you have oil rigs breaking. So the Ukrainian attacks on oil infrastructure aren't great, but it's not the whole story. And that's something, when I made a video on this, and initially I thought like, oh wow, let's do a video on how these drone attacks are affecting the price of oil. And as I went through this video, as I did the research for it, I realized that it wasn't the only game in town. There was some other factors involved, and that really opened my eyes to how Russia has a lot of problems right now.
Yeah, I mean, we cover the economy a lot now on the channel, and I remember reading a report, actually, I think it was in the first few months after the war really fully began, if you like, and it was from RUSI in the UK, and it was talking about this whole, like, the revelation, basically, when it was discovered the Russians were using a high amount of Western things like chips and other bits of tech in their military equipment. So what does this tell us now, if the Russians have been unable to acquire military equipment or replacements, but also now their economic side, their oil refinery, the sort of the bit that funds their war machine? What do you think is the sentiment in Moscow, and where do they get replacements from? China?
Well, that's a tough one, right? Because anything that you get replaced from China, there's going to be a hard currency cost to it. So, again, if you have a choice between buying, let's say, a Chinese armored vehicle, which seems like armored vehicles aren't that useful. I believe there was an armored thrust a couple of days ago that was just schwacked by Ukraine. Armored vehicles aren't that useful anymore. Drones are useful. So if you're buying armored vehicles, not only do you have like a different parts schedule for those vehicles, different maintenance schedule, different parts have to be ordered. You have to train people on how to maintain these vehicles. Unless you get Chinese contractors in to maintain these vehicles, there is a learning curve involved. You also have to train people on these vehicles. And they might not be what you think. It could be something as simple as, I don't know the conditions, but China is going to make Chinese armored vehicles sized for the average Chinese soldier, right? The average Chinese soldier is 5'7". Their vehicles are going to be a little bit smaller. Their seats are going to be a little bit smaller. Their controls might be smaller. Whereas you put a 6 foot tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Russian in them, that might be a little uncomfortable. So the ergonomics might not be there. So there's a number of problems doing that. But the biggest problem is China's going to want hard currency. And you could say, well, they're getting that from oil, right? Russia sends oil to China. China buys the oil. Russia gets hard currency they can spend on other things. Problem with that is you only need so much oil. Let's say that China needs 100 barrels per day. I'm sure it's more than 100 barrels per day, but just giving 100 as a well, that's the maximum amount of oil you can sell to China. Now, China, if they were smart, they might buy more oil and put it into a reserve or something like that. But let's say the reserves are good. Well, if I have a bunch of oil I want to sell you, and you're like, hey, look, I have enough oil. Well, what else can you sell, right? So that's kind of an issue there. There might be a finite limit to how much hard currency Russia can gain by selling their oil. And every day that oil gets more and more expensive to pull out of the ground, which is an issue as well. Because again, their drill rigs are breaking. So I think what we're going to see in the next couple of weeks or months is we're going to see Russia's economy start going haywire. In fact, I believe there's already been layoffs at local car manufacturing centers, car factories. And that's because there's only so many parts, right? And if you have all the parts for a car, but you don't have a part for the door because that part hasn't been machined yet, well, you can't sell the car.
No.
And you can't sell the car unless someone's willing to buy it. And who's going to buy a car if there's no gas? Right.
Yeah.
So there's quite a few issues in there.
The Russian economy, I think, I'm not one who says it's collapsing. Like some people say it's been collapsing for the past 25 years, which, collapsing tends to have a degree of imminency about it. So, yeah, I'm more one to say it's gradually. It's a slow motion car crash, but no, we're coming to a head now for sure. And that sort of makes me wonder about, well, actually, I made a video about that, and I'm curious about your thoughts about the broader oil supply chain, because what I saw from my research was that China is really stockpiling quite a lot of oil now. And it's trying to be more of a player, sort of like OPEC is all over the place. OPEC Plus is all over the place with Russia, obviously now. Saudi is hedging against India with Pakistan. You've got these sorts of shifts occurring. But China, interestingly, is stocking oil. And so to bring in the China element a bit, because I do find the relationship between these two so intertwined at this point. What are you seeing when you look at China's relationship to Russia and their willingness to support them? Because they've been, saying no lethal aid, non-lethal aid, but from what I can understand, there's been a lot of Chinese hardware in parts of Russian military equipment. And from your recent trip there.
Probably in parts. I think China's always going to do its best for China, right? Like, there's a saying, like, nations don't have friends, they have allies, but I kind of think in China's case, they don't really have allies either. They have people who are useful and people who are not useful, right? I mean, I've talked before about Iran and how if Iran essentially missed their window to purchase Chinese jet fighters, and they missed that window because China is now producing jet fighters and missiles and surface-to-air launchers for their own invasion of Taiwan, right? So right now, if Iran, I know you asked me about Russia, I'm going to get to that. But right now, if Iran wanted to buy military equipment, there's really no place they can buy it from. And that's a heck of a problem. So I think that China's relationship with Russia is, right now, Russia is useful. And the day Russia stops being useful is the day you're going to see less stuff going over to Russia from China.
Yeah, you don't have friends, you have interests, right? What about then Putin's provocations on the Eastern Front? A remarkable piece I read in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about Poland's build-up. And obviously now we've got this sort of Eastern Sentinel idea, and we've also got these flyovers, provocations, incursions, whatever word you want to call them. What does that demonstrate about Putin's calculus right now and his willingness to risk sort of Russian military equipment?
Well, I don't. So it's a very small risk, but I believe the reason Russia did that was to scare the Baltics into buying more military equipment. So remember, in the same case with Iran, there's only so much military equipment that can be produced per year, right? And if you can't buy that anywhere else, well, then you just have to go without or maybe develop your own thing. And I often liken it to Axis and Allies. You have a finite number of IPCs, a finite number of industrial production certificates, right? And you can put that toward Flamingo missiles, or you can put that toward building drones, or you can put that toward whatever. But for the most part, there's a finite amount of stuff that you can manufacture. So if by sending fighter jets over Estonia, by sending drones into Poland, they scare the Baltics and Poland enough, they will buy more military equipment, making less military equipment available on the open market for Ukraine. So I think that was kind of the strategy there. It was actually a very smart strategy that Putin executed. So if he does it and he loses two fighters, well, they're heroes of the Russian Federation.
Could you frame it in a different way? Are you saying that Putin was attempting to get NATO members to be more focused on their own domestic national security at the cost of Ukraine support?
I would say that is accurate. I would definitely say that's accurate. And, when you have God, when you have a finite amount of military equipment that you can source, right? If you eat that all up, then Ukraine has less, and it just makes it harder for Ukraine to defend itself. So I think that was kind of Putin's strategy all along.
But it seems like a rather sort of short-lived strategy. What's the fallout from that longer term?
It didn't work.
Pissed off.
Like not everything works. I mean, if you think about it, the what else didn't work was Russia attacked Kursk, right? And they held Kursk. And did that work? Well, kind of tough to say, right? Like, we're not going to know what worked and what didn't work until kind of the end, right? Or maybe death of 1,000 cuts kind of thing. But it's certainly possible that they might do something and it just doesn't work, and then you move on to the next thing.
Like,
I mean, one of the reasons that Russia uses gray zone tactics is they want people to talk to their governments and say, hey, I don't think that we should be funding Ukraine, right? So they say, oh, Ukraine is corrupt. Zelensky just bought another mansion, that kind of thing. And what that does is if you can't end, let's say, if you want to end ammunition production, right? You don't want the United States to send cruise missiles to Ukraine. Well, you could blow up the factory. Russia has that capability. But no, they could send bombers loaded with cruise missiles over to Cuba, and they could fire missiles at American factories. And there's probably not much we could do about that. We might be able to scramble a couple of fighters. We might notice the movement and call it an escalation or whatever. But for the most part, we don't have that much of a chance against that, right? But it would cause Article 5, and Russia doesn't want to go to war with NATO. You could also pay someone some money to sabotage the equipment inside the factory, right? I mean, that would prevent missiles from being sent over to Ukraine. But if that spy is caught, that saboteur is caught, then you have a major problem on your hands. But if you convince the public, the American taxpayer, that Ukraine is selling these cruise missiles to Mexican drug cartels, which sounds absurd, but Tucker Carlson says that's a fact. It's a fact that half of all the weapons are being sent to drug cartels. Well, then the effect is the same. That's why I've said that information warfare is a weapons effect.
On the information warfare, obviously this has been going on for a long time, and nothing can remain static in the theatre of war. So, when we first had our first conversation 2.5 years ago, I would ask you quite broad questions about disinformation tactics, techniques. In the time that things have been getting worse for Moscow, better for Crimea, Kiev, have you seen an involvement, a refinement, a deterioration of Russia's attempts to, what they've done in Moldova, in Georgia recently?
I haven't seen any kind of deterioration, and I guess that's mainly because it's so cheap to do. It is so cheap to put out disinformation, and it's so effective that they have no reason to stop doing it. Now, they might have to change tactics, but the amount of money that you're spending in order to get a weapons effect is negligible, compared to the cost of a weapons system. So the weapons system that you might use to strike an American cruise missile factory, that could cost millions of dollars. You could spend that millions of dollars convincing Americans to talk to their congressmen about not sending weapons over to Ukraine, and you've achieved the same effect. So there's certainly an advantage to it. I haven't really seen them stop, but they have pivoted. Although right now there's a major problem because for the longest time the focus was on President Trump's administration and how there's a lot of people in President Trump's administration. I'm not going to call them pro-Russia, but what they noticed was that whenever they said something that was pro-Russia, or I should say anti-Ukraine, whenever they did that, they got a lot of activity on social media. And in a lot of ways, that can become very, very addictive because you might post something that's pro-Ukraine and a couple of real people say, yes, that's fantastic. I'm with you, Senator. And then you post something that's anti-Ukraine or you retweet something that's anti-Ukraine, and that gets thousands upon thousands of views. Now, some of those views might be bots, but you don't know that. All you see is, well, that thing I just said is more popular than the other thing, so I'm going to keep going with that thing. But I think what you had is this feedback loop where you had a lot of people on the right who were backing Russia because, well, I get a lot of views whenever I say something pro-Russia, so I'm going to keep doing that. And that was effective until Vladimir Putin pushed it a little too far and was kind of playing President Trump for a fool. Now, I think that in some ways, President Trump has kind of surrounded himself with people who only tell him what he wants to hear. But at some point, this guy spoke with somebody. Maybe he talked with his wife. I don't know. And someone told him, like, hey, this guy's laughing at you. And now he's kind of on Ukraine's side again. Or it could have just been like, hey, I met with this guy and it doesn't seem like he's serious. So that whole meeting in Alaska, that might have been a good thing. People were saying, oh my God, he's going to be in a car alone with Putin. God knows what the guy's going to say to him. But maybe that was a good thing because I think President Trump realized that this guy is never going to end the war.
What lessons should the West be doing? Germany's waking up. Europe seems to be waking up. But what sort of principles should people be taking mostly from Ukraine, apart from resistance and unrelenting defense?
Well, I think probably the biggest takeaway here is you need to have a robust Air Force because I know people want to talk about drones and stuff like that, but the fact is that Russia can launch as many drones as they want. Let's say they went to war with NATO. Russia can launch as many drones as they want, but they're going to do it hungry and without any generator fuel, right? To charge those drones. They might get a couple of drones off, and then they're not going to be able to recharge these things. The one thing that, to go into a different area of conflict here, you look at Israel versus Iran. Why was Israel able to defeat Iran? Well, because they had long-range precision fires. They were using aircraft to launch missiles or drop bombs.